Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Hood. I'm professor for modern and contemporary philosophy here at the University of Dundee. I'd like to welcome you all very dearly, all who are present here, and everyone who is present online to this event in the Dundee Philosophy Speaker Series that is organized with the support of the Royal Institute of Philosophy and hosted by the Philosophy Programme at the Scottish Centre for Continental Philosophy. It's truly a special event today. We're able and proper enjoyment so often springs from repetition. My very dear friend, Mladen Dolar, to whom I'm immensely grateful that you took the time and energy to spend time and thought with us today and tomorrow. Let me very quickly do a little bit of academic praising of Mladen, who's a world-renowned thinker and who does precisely need that. But sometimes what is superfluous might also be enjoyable and amusing. Mladen is senior research fellow in the philosophy department at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia and professor for philosophy at the European Graduate School, the EGS. He obtained a diploma in philosophy and French from the University of Ljubljana in 1978, the year I was born, by the by, not suggesting that there's any connection between the two facts. He continued to study at the Université de Paris 8, Saint-Denis, from 79 to 80, and at the University of Westminster, London, from 89 to 90. In 1992, he received a PhD in philosophy from the University of Ljubljana with a dissertation on Hegel called, if I'm not mistaken, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Dialectic, the Dialectic of Consciousness and Self-Consciousness. Mladen was then from 1980 a member of the philosophy department, appointed assistant professor in 1984, docent of German classical philosophy in 1992, associate professor of philosophy and theoretical psychoanalysis in 1996, and in 2002 took up his current position as senior research fellow. In the late 1970s, we return to my birthday somewhat, and together with Slavoj Žižek and Rasko Moznik, Dolar founded the infamous Ljubljana School of Psychoanalysis, bringing together German idealism, Hegel in particular, Marxism and psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and what a combination we should not take for granted, for an exploration of contemporary issues. Mladen is also one of the founders of the Ljubljana-based Society for Theoretical Psychoanalysis, as well as of the Society for Cultural Studies. He's the author of many books in Slovene. If I'm not mistaken, 14 is the actual number, maybe 50, and is absolutely world-renowned for obviously A Voice and Nothing More, which was published in English with MIT Press in 2006. Opera Second Death with Slavoj Žižek that was published in 2001. What's in a Name, published in 2004. And I think everyone is awaiting the already announced next book for this moment. Risky to speculate when it will actually come, but I can't wait. Today he will speak on ontology. It is truly wonderful to have you here, Mladen. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you, Frank. It's the second time I'm here in Dundee. The first time was, I have very lucid memory. The first time was really great. And at that occasion, I spoke about rock gossip and rumors. And actually, tomorrow in the seminar, I will give a sequel to that lecture, which was 4 years ago in a completely different world. We forgot what that world looked like. So now I'm really very happy to be back. And I will rather exceptionally start on a personal note. I never do this somehow. for the first time, I will take up two personal anecdotes, but which are kind of iconic. So beyond personal, there is something which defines my position and enunciation, and it's described in an epic. Namely, I first came to Paris in June 1969 as a very young lad in the framework of Alliance Française. I can understand if you already greet me with okay, boomer. This defines a certain generation. I missed the revolution by 1 year, but Paris was still covered with graffiti. The lingering traces were very much there in the air. So they put us up in a dorm in Lycée des Chansons de Sailly, a famous location in the posh 16th district. And as fate would have it, there was a large graffiti on the dorm wall. Nous voulons jouir sans entrave, which is one of the famous May 68 slogans. We want to enjoy without impediments, without inhibitions, obstructions, held-ups, restrictions, whatever. And mark the incongruence of the site. This was in the prestigious institution in the richest arrondissement in Paris. So that was my first encounter with Paris. It greeted me in a grand way. And maybe I just make a note on the question of belonging to a certain generation. I don't believe in generations. Make it quick. This talk about generations always entails a reduction of historical time to some cyclic time, sort of quasi-biological circle of generations. And against this kind of understanding of May 68, I'll just give you one quote by Christian Ross, which is really an excellent author of May 68 and its legacy, which goes like this: students, youth, and generation, which has three qualifiers of the May 68. Dissolve politics into sociology by positing distinct circumscribable social locations, a definitive residence for this movement. And yet, 68 was about nothing so much as flight from social location. May brought together socially heterogeneous groups and individuals whose convergence eroded particularities, including those of class and age. So holding up to this legacy is not holding up to a generation, but precisely to a space of dislocation, a space of dislocation. Now coming back to this slogan. The slogan itself stemmed from the situationist stock, and you know the situationist international background. And to make it quick, one can say that the May slogans were largely divided into two groups: the Marxist-Maoist on the one hand versus the situationist on the other. The former using the orthodox Marxist vocabulary, proletariat, class struggle, party organization, etc., much to the later embarrassment of the aging revolutionaries, while the latter was held to surrealism, Dadaism, the extort, play, game, enjoyment, feast, intervention, détournement. And Guy Debord's Society of Spectacle, which was the Situationist Bible, was published in 1967 as a prelude to May. And this particular slogan, one of the most striking brief summaries of the movement, along with the other one, Soyons réalistes, demandons l'impossible. Let's be realistic, let's demand the impossible. So this particular slogan stemmed from Mustafa Kayati, a Tunisian militant, from his pamphlet, Misère en milieu étudiant, on student misery, in 1966. And the first sentence, this ran, Les révolutions prolétariennes seront des fêtes ou ne seront pas. Proletarian revolutions will be feasts, celebrations, festivities, or they will not be. The life they announce will be itself under the sign of the feast. Le jeu, playing the game, is the ultimate rationality of this feast, to live without a dead time, to enjoy it without impediments. Vivre sans temps mort, jouir sans entrave, are the only rules that it will accept. Okay, so the spirit of situationism is all there, and also its paradox. The critique of the society of spectacle should be practiced through a proper spectacle of the feast, destined to undo, to rip apart the forces, fueling and fueled by late capitalism. And just add a footnote, like, I don't know how this sounds in English, but late capitalism can be read as a sort of rule of thumb, like Mr. Jones, something. So perhaps we are living in the afterlife of the late capitalism. And this could be something that defines the age. And there was a whole ambiguity of it. Isn't the injunction to enjoy and without impediments also the basic injunction of the consumer society, promising boundless enjoyment? Does it tacitly or overtly fuel the whole advertising industry? And by extension, not that time, please, not that time. Sometimes here are some more situational slogans. Boredom is counter-revolutionary. Ne travaillez jamais. Don't you ever work. And seriously, how quickly the injunction to work would be somehow made to go hand in hand with the injunction for environment. So it points to something rather disturbing fact. Enjoyment is promised to be boundless without restrictions, can be easily recuperated as a driving force of the very society against which it was proposed, society driven by surplus enjoyment. And can one simply postulate the window of puissance as opposed to the page response? How to tell the two apart? And there's always a danger of this moralistic stance. Your enjoyment is not the right kind of enjoyment. I'm telling you how to enjoy. And what looms on the horizon with the consumer society is precisely what Lacan would pin down as the injunction of the superego, I mean the injunction to enjoy, encapsulating our predicament after the decline of patriarchal prohibitions. And the slogan, "We want to enjoy without impediments," stands strictly on the edge between emancipation and the superego, sort of very thin edge. And if you look at it from this angle, the slogan embodies in a minimal way also the larger ambiguity of May 68 and what it stands for. One way to read it would be, this may well be the one demand of May 68 that was fulfilled. It's a wish come true. We have been bombarded with enjoyment without impediments ever since. And one doesn't need necessarily psychoanalysis to know that the wish come true turns into nightmare. But anyway, Paris met me with this inscription on its gate. I thought the law just as perplexed as the man from the country in Kafka. And I was indeed a man from the country coming from Yugoslavia. And there was the gate with this new law, I guess, both of Kafka, enjoy without impediments. How could one enter this new avatar of the gate of the law? It's just as impossible as entering the other one, where what prevented the entry in the first place was precisely that there was no prohibition, there was no impediment. It was like law without impediments, which may be a way to summarize Kafka's endeavor, and we'll come back to Kafka at some point. Now, psychoanalysis was a major part of this vigorous movement, epitomized by May 68 as a sort of shorthand. But this was incredibly a time of condensation of Che Guevara, Martin Luther King, the anti-Vietnam War, protests, Rudy Dutschke, the Cultural Revolution in China, radical politics, the anti-colonial struggles, Woodstock, Chicago 7, sexual revolution, Frankfurt School, structuralism, avant-garde movements. I mean, it was a time of a big opening. So May 68 is sort of shorthand for an intellectual, political, artistic, social movement affecting the very habitus, the greatest protest against capitalist societies after the growing prosperity and the progress of the afterward decades. We want to enjoy without impediments was immediately acquired a sort of sexual sense and was taken to be a motto of psychoanalysis. It seemed that psychoanalysis, in the midst of the libertarian political vortex, stood for jouissance, stood up for jouissance, for its liberation, for the removal of all impediments of repression. And this was taken as the political mission, as a program of psychoanalysis. And here is the first lesson I ever learned from Lacan. Not quite then, it took some time, but to put it in a nutshell, in another shorthand of this shorthand, jouissance is the impediment. The obstacle is its inner impasse, not an external imposition. It could be removed or shaken off. It was Lacan who insisted all along on this paradoxical nature of jouissance against the spirit of the time, in face of the deceptive idea of lifting repression and everything would turn out fine. And he insisted on jouissance as a cumbersome thing we are stuck with. Jouissance is a stumbling block. Our being is riveted to jouissance. And this is also our curse. If one doesn't enjoy the way one would want to, and this is, after all, what is called symptom. This is a starting point of psychoanalysis. Not that we lack enjoyment, but there is a surplus we can't come to terms with and cannot be rid of. If we don't enjoy it the way we want to, it's not merely due to external restrictions, but to the inner deadlock of jouissance itself. Jouissance is a deadlock. This was the difficult first lesson of Lacan in the midst of the enthusiasm for sexual liberation. And actually, Lacan's response to the other, even more famous slogan of '68 was exactly analogous. Let's be realistic and demand the impossible. His response was, the real is the impossible. And this is, by the way, what took Freud quite some time to realize. And I take just one quote from Freud. This is from Civilization Contents. There's sometimes one seems to perceive that it's not only the pressure of civilization, but something in the essence of the sexual function itself, which denies us full satisfaction and urges us along. This may be wrong. It's hard to decide. It's Freud. So I leave just this one sentence by one quote by Freud in suspense. Now, this was in 1969. In the fall of that same year, Lacan gave this famous seminar on the other side of psychoanalysis, the seminar in the wake of '68. It was critical of his seminars, the one where he proposed the notorious theory of all forces, his own very particular response to the May events. The elaborate theory of the discourse as a social bond, going back to Hegel, going back to Marx, bringing together all the strands of his theory and formalizing them in a minimal matrix of 4 elements. I can't go into any of this here. I will just focus on the last session of this time, in June 1970, under the title, The Power of the Impossible. And with this session, where he offhandedly proposed a new concept based on a pun, and one could say a puncept. I, at some point, thought I invented a new word, a sort of as it turned out, it has already been proposed by somebody called Gregory Ulmer, who is a professor in Florida. So I claim no. I think it's a good word, concept, as opposed to concept. So this new concept is ontology. Ontology is spelled with an H in French, but the pun works only in French, and is in the nature of puns. They pertain to particular glitches of particular language, and it's based on a sound encounter of hauntology, with la honte, which is shame in French. There is no etymological connection. The pun, as all good puns, depends on the minimal difference. The more minimal, the better. There's only the soundless H, so-called Ashkunson, the soundless sound, which makes a difference. Nevertheless, imposing a caesura. 2 words that sound exactly alike, since H is never pronounced in French. It's a non-existing sound, non-phoneme, just letter. So what is the connection between ontology and shame? Ready-made puns are ready-made. Although ubiquitous, just as hard to find as the bicycle swirl. Pun is like the reverse of the metaphor. The relation between the literal and figurative meaning. Or in metaphors, often condition, multiple meanings of a certain word, there is an analogy which allows for the extension of meaning beyond the literal. And the simplest would be, this is Aristotle's example, the foot of the mountain. You can easily see what the analogy is. But in puns, we start with mere homonymy, the contingent overlap of sounds, the chance sound encounter of words with different meanings and etymologies. And then we start looking for analogies that may be implied or made possible or produced with this accidental coincidence, like between hauntology and honte. This is an intriguing point with the quirks and glitches of particular language, the chance encounters, the homonymies, contingent singularities, all that Lacan put under the heading of la langue, start functioning as the resources and levers of universality. So the exceptions turn into the unexpected cues and clues of the universal. And there one could go back to the Aristotelian ban on homonymies, actually on the very first page of his logic, and the struggle against the sophist, the sophistry, which was launched at the very birth of philosophy. I give two quick references, and one is to the work of Barbara Cassin, a huge case of it, and particularly her dictionary of the untranslatables, and a very quick reminder that Hegel was a great promoter of this. He despised what he called the philosophische Kunstsprache, the artificial philosophical language, used the particularities, the peculiarities, the quirks of everyday language. Now, ontology has a bearing on the question of ontology, which provides a strange side perspective. Furthermore, it raises the question of punning as a conceptual strategy. And finally, it raises the question of shame as having vast political implications, in line with this most political of Lacan's seminars. And I could just add here, there is an analogous, homologous, and better known poem proposed by Derrida, with his invention of hauntology, from haunt. No etymological connection, honte in French, again the inaudible H, haunting French words, with the same ambition, at least at the outset, to intervene into ontology, to consider the status of punning, and to point to the dimension implied already in his title, The Spectres of Marx. But this would demand another paper. I will take up just 2 points, the beginning and the end of this session. This is an enigmatic session that would demand commentary, but the opening sentence is striking and unexpected if you go in plans like this. It does have to be said that it is unusual to die of shame. Quite out of the blue, he starts by this sentence. So, the implication is first, people don't usually die of shame, at least not anymore. Not like François Vatel, whom Lacan mentions in this session, the butler of Prince Condé, who was to organize a big 3-day feast to which all the court was invited in 1671. French movie Vatel with Gérard Depardieu and Uma Thurman. Not that I recommend it. So he ordered 12 shipments of seafood, fish, etc., but only 2 arrived. So as a consequence, he was overcome by great shame, mortal shame, and committed suicide, although this was not his fault. His body was discovered when someone came to tell him that the fish had finally arrived. It's a true story. 4 people died for honor, with honor being connects with la honte, or honneur, honte, shame, etc. Based on punning. But I will not go there. I think honor is ultimately different from shame. It boils down to the question of desire. Desire is recognition, or the struggle for pure prestige, if you go back to this Hegelian reference. So there is a thesis. If one doesn't die of shame, not any longer, it has to do with the withering of the big other, the decline of the big other in modern times, or even the decline of the big other as a defining trait of modernity. With the decline of paternal authority and all traditional authorities based on its model, on transcendence, etc. There is no more shame disproportion, and as a consequence, great increase of shamelessness. This is 1970. And Lacan there proposes a reflexive formula of shame, on the basis of this first statement, namely that there is shame of not having died of shame. It's reflexive shame, or double shame. To be dying of shame versus to die of shame. One is dying of shame, but doesn't die. There is the shame of having survived dying of shame. The shame of survival where one should have died but didn't. A shame of exposure in the very survival and its mere being. The shame thus wouldn't pertain one falling short of the demand, of not living up to the injunctions or expectations, of appearing as lacking in the eyes of the other. This is rather guilt. Guilt has to do with lack and desire. And one can take guilt upon oneself, even if one is technically not guilty, like Oedipus. With guilt, with sin, there is confession, repentance, there can be absolution and redemption. It's sort of epic. But there is a German phrase, this only works in German. Man kann sich entschuldigen, aber nicht entschämen. One can apologize, which is be guilted, but one cannot be deshamed. Guilt implies subjectivation, while shame, in shame, one is desubjectivized. Or more precisely, there has to be a reflexive formulation of this. One subjectivizes one's own desubjectivation. One subjectivizes what cannot be subjectivized. And this is actually a very good formula proposed by Agamben, but I want to sidestep Agamben here and the whole massive discussion, the massive context of Holocaust and the shame of survival is all the great problems this presents. And I also want to sidestep the phenomenological discussion of shame as a structural determinant of human condition. Have a discussion of shame in Levinas, in Sartre, in Heidegger, Dos, Scheu, etc. So shame rather has to do not with the lack, but with the surplus. With the fact that one is thrown into a situation that one cannot take upon oneself. One is not responsible for it, but one is riveted. One cannot disentangle oneself from it. Hence, one is exposed in one's very being. There is no exit. There is no evasion. And one is overcome by shame suddenly, without mercy. And Kant, when briefly dealing with shame in his ontology, also opposes the temporality of passion, of guilt, of self-contempt, on the one hand, persistently keep knowing and burning, to the suddenness and violence of the onslaught of shame. So guilt concerns particular actions or failures or properties, while shame concerns the whole being, the entire person, what one is rather than what one does or has. The whole person has to be completely obliterated. Shame pertains to a surplus, not a lack. There is something too much that should go away, that wouldn't. There's the shame of still being there, or one would want to vanish, sink to the ground. Shame is physiological. It is expressed in blushing, And Darwin wrote on blushing in the expression of the emotions in men and animals in 1872, and basically saying, this is what animals can't do. He takes the spirit. I quote, the mind has to be affected. A brief quote from Darwin. He takes the big other, one's intimate attachment to the big other. Blushing is like the immediate bodily expression of the symbolic. It is for Darwin profoundly human. I quote, the most peculiar and most human of all expressions, of all these expressions of animals, in men, emotional, in men and animals. For in other respects, there is like a continuity and evolvement and evolution between the two. And he curiously adds, blind people blush and people of color blush. So it affects those who don't see and those who don't show. Animals can get blood in their faces if they are enraged, aggressive, sexually incited, but not with shame. So with shame, there is the production of physiological effects against one's will without empirical causes, which is the sign of the causality of the signifier. We cannot cause the blush by any physical means, says Darwin. And yes, I will just quote one quote from Agamben, concerns blushing. He says, blushing is the remainder that in each subjectivation testifies to desubjectivation, and in each desubjectivation testifies to the subject. So this subjectivizing one's own desubjectivation. Okay. One is exposed in one's contingent being and enjoyment, not covered by the signifier, handed over to something one cannot take upon oneself. One is laid bare in what Günther Anders called das ontische Mitgift, the ontical dowry, with all those respects that one is not responsible for but cannot get away from. And the ontical dowry is for him as alles nicht ichhafte überhaupt, everything not pertaining to the ego, the pre-individual of whatever kind, which the ego partakes without being able to do anything for it or against it. Or something that is mitgegeben, given as a part and parcel of from the basis of our bodily condition, with all its handicaps, to the low social origins. But this doesn't mean that shame pertains to our natural givenness that we can do nothing about. It's the effect of culture, even the pure effect of culture. It exposes the link with the big other and the concomitant contingent of one's response with the symbolic. The shame is the effect of the signifying cut. And this is like strikingly illustrated by the Bible with the expulsion from the paradise at the fall. Adam and Eve, while in paradise, were naked but not ashamed. Life in the Garden of Eden was shameless. The moment they ate from the tree of knowledge, the first consequence was that they realized that they were naked, as they had been all along. So this is the first step of knowledge, and they started to be ashamed of their nudity, suddenly looking for fig leaves. So it's the cultural symbolic cut that induces shame as the first effect. It's not that we are exposed in our bare life, but rather what is exposed is that our life is never bare. And this is where the effect of shame concerns ontology, points to the crux between the symbolic cut, where the symbolic cuts into being, in such a way that it profoundly engages our intimacy. And maybe this can serve as a shortcut to Lacan's notion of extimacy. It's something very intimate being exposed, laid bare to vision. An odd connection can be made with the uncanny, the logic of haunting. Freud's famous paper, the uncanny, das Unheimliche. With das Unheimliche, something has come to light that should have remained secret and hidden. This was actually Schelling's definition of the uncanny, quoted, espoused, and condoned by Freud. And this is the dimension that Derrida insisted on. linking it to both Marx and Freud. And this goes also for shame. But what comes to light, the uncanny, is a ghostly apparition at odds with the objective world where it appears, something that cannot be pinned down and to positive, verifiable existence. And this is why it keeps haunting. And this is why it demands ontology to account for it, for a mode of being that it neither is nor is not, escaping the alternative, Hamlet's alternative of to be or not. Whereas with shame, we are ourselves that apparition. We cannot be disentangled from it. We are the locus of disclosure of what should have remained hidden, but helplessly tied to our bodies, blushing, wanting to die, and surviving our death. What should have remained hidden is made too conspicuous, manifested too blatantly, as opposed to the elusive nature of haunting operations. Now I'll make a sort of trivial, I start from a trivial anecdote. There is an anecdote stemming from socialist times in Slovenia. The famous TV presenter was reading news, and always in a very formal attire and with perfect makeup. This befits the mouthpiece of the big other. And suddenly a fly started flying around, walking on her base of hair and flying a bit, coming back lazily, exploring her skin. A banal intrusion into a highly codified setting in front of the very large TV audience. The presenter didn't budge, just continued in her formal way, faithful to her symbolic mandate that she should live up to, not letting down her assignment, or it was being trampled upon by distributed disturbance. The commission was to maintain the symbolic vision and not be diverted by whatever happens. And when this was over, she broke down. She said she was never so ashamed in her life, and that this was the most traumatic incident of her career. And she had a long career. She's still considered to be a TV legend. So her symbolic mandate was disgraced and tarnished, hit by a downfall. So she was left exposed without coverage. She was helplessly left in the open. Now, this was like 40 years ago. And TV presenters conveying news were expected to be the mouthpiece of the big other, with all the rigidity and formality of circumstance. And in socialist circumstances, this stiffness, this formality was far greater than the West. And what is interesting, using this anecdote, is that this couldn't really happen today. In the times when presenters nowadays present themselves as people like you and me, informally joking, conversing, making asides, so one can imagine that a fly could even be seen as a welcome intrusion to make the setting even more relaxed, at ease. It would perhaps invent on the spot, some witty connection with the news at hand and contribute to infotainment. And the fact that this is not possible in the present habitus of the media is indicative, in a small, in a simple way, of the changing status of the big other, of its deactivation. And if such a presenter is not quite possible anymore, she would appear ridiculous in her stiffness, then we now commonly have the TV shows that were unimaginable at the time, such as reality shows. What is the reality being shown? They present the very opposite, supposed epitome of informality, the triviality of everyday, the absence of a symbolic mandate, the particular way of enjoyment. The particular ways of enjoyment are put in full display. The attraction is that we're not looking at some special attraction or something with distinction, but watching people allegedly like us in their utmost on their pursuits. What is the message? We could put it this way: we are not ashamed, and there is nothing to be ashamed of. The more flies, the better. Look at us enjoying without shame. Look at our narcissistic display, including display of envy, malice, selfishness, whatever. there is nothing to be ashamed of. And shamelessness is the very object of spectacle. Maybe this can be taken as the great adage of postmodern times. And from there, okay, this is a quick slide. One can easily make a further step. The big star of reality shows was Donald Trump, before making the bid for presidency, which was like the continuation of the reality show. This is the habitus he stems from. His message could be very simplest. I'm not ashamed. It's really
who's not ashamed and is making a political career of it. Okay, this rather quick slide from the ontological problem of shame to the problem of the prevailing obscenity parading in public space, conditioning the rise of fabulous. So here's the topic, Trump and ontology, kind of unexpected consequence of this. Problem of the big status, of the status of the big other, and its decline. Okay, now let me go back to the last sentence of the session. The bottom shot is this. If there are some reasons for your presence here in such numbers, which has often been an inconvenience to me, and is frankly incomprehensible to me. So you know that Lacan's proverbially difficult to follow. There's a masses of people coming to them. So if there are some reasons for a presence here in such numbers, it is because I happen to make you ashamed. Not too much, but just enough. C'est que, pas trop, justement assez, il m'arrive de vous faire honte. Shame is the last word of the seminar. Thus, at the very end, he situates himself in a position of enunciation, as someone whose function or duty or role is to make his audience a little bit ashamed, to introduce shame in a time which appears to be a time of increasing shamelessness, to make himself an agent of the absent big other. This is directly opposed to the general injunction of postmodern. Don't be ashamed of yourself. There's nothing to be ashamed of yourself, which is precisely in line with what he proposed as an injunction of the superior, injunction to enjoy. And this way then easily goes hand in hand with the whole thrust of shaming the other, with the tendency to cancel. Shaming is but the flip side of this stance of shamelessness, calling out the others to be ashamed and hence to disappear. How to read this last sentence? Keeping this dimension of shame can here be seen as Lacan's attempt at politic intervention. To conjure something of the role of the analyst in front of the crowd. Of course, there is a very thin line to hold this apart from the moralistic stance of indignation. He tried to modify, to assuage, moderate it by saying, not too much, just enough. What would be a good measure? What would be a good measure of shame? And there are other pronouncements of his, like, je persévère, I persevere, the injunction of perseverance. Persévère in French means the severe father. So how to hold the injunction of perseverance separate from the figure father? How to hold on to this embody, impersonate, as it were, the absence of the big other, it nevertheless maintains the dimension of the big other. So the problem of the analyst as a figure of the other is as irreducible to other figures, irreducible to the figure of or a counselor, teacher, sage, guru, or something. How to sustain the other without this moral indignation, is it there? How to sustain the lacking other. As an aside, a literary intervention implies transference. Lacan devoted the large part of his seminar transfer in 1951 to the reading of Plato's Symposium, and in particular, the speech of Alcibiades praising Socrates, and where he introduces the whole notion of agalma as the hidden treasure, and hence the introduction of the object A. Well, and here is a part of this speech by the young and beautiful and dissolute Alcibiades.
Socrates. Quote from Plato now. Socrates is the only man in the world who has made me feel shame. Ah, you didn't think I had it in me, did you?
Yes, he makes me feel ashamed. I know perfectly well that I can't prove he is wrong when he tells me what I should do. Yet the moment I leave his side, I go back to my old ways. My whole life has become one constant effort to escape from him and keep away. But when I see him, I feel deeply ashamed because I'm doing nothing about my way of life. The confession of this very beautiful, the history, the story of Alcibiades. So it's like a connection to the very beginning of philosophy. At the inception of philosophy, there is a testimony of shame induced by philosophy. Shame that one would want to escape as Alcibiades, but also as a feeling of incentive to philosophy, its effects. You know, Lacan's lifelong infatuation with the figure of Socrates, in whom he saw the unresolved enigma of the analyst avant la lettre. That's his invocation of shame, himself speaking to the young and beautiful and possibly dissolute youth. Does it imply that he implicitly takes on the role of Socrates, who secretly identifies Socrates? Maybe not too much, just enough. I want to think of Badiou in his writing to the Republic, of several other pieces where he somehow doesn't quite resist the temptation of identifying with Socrates. Socrates who would not be quite a sage. And curiously, Deleuze and Guattari use the same parts much later in What is Philosophy. I quote, "The shame of being human is not experienced merely in extreme situations described by Primo Levi, but also in trivial circumstances when we are confronted with the baseness and vulgarity of existence linked to democracy and monarchy, the compromise we struggle with. This feeling of shame is one of the strongest motives in philosophy." This is from the opposite end, from the Deleuzian end. They didn't quite speak about instilling shame, rather as a feeling of shame, the feeling of shame one feels or should properly feel as the strongest incentive of philosophy, but the shame that is covered over and normalized to the point of disappearance in our participation in the night. Now, Lacan intervenes in a situation where, as he perceives it, shamelessness is on the surge. He addresses his audience, which in these post-May times consisted to a large extent of young people attracted to his seminar by the pull of the time. And he mentions Vincennes at the beginning of the session, a new university founded as a result of the May events. But not simply not to praise it, he rather makes a pun with obscene, Vincennes, obscene. So what he directly addresses in this situation is not really the shamelessness, the obscenity of the figures of power, that is also looms on the horizon, but in the immediate sense, that of the insurgents of the May revolutionaries. And to come back to the beginning, precisely of those who put on their banner, "Nous voulons jouir sans entrave." We want to enjoy without hindrances, and we could translate it also, we want to enjoy without shame and without guilt. Shame would be seen as the effect of the conservative, repressive society, its prudishness or its hypocrisy. So this parting shot of the seminar can also be read as Lacan's response to the slogan, "May revolt." What is needed is an intervention of shame to instill some shame into those who bet on transgression and the lifting of repression. And what symptomatically happened in the last decades is that transgression, under the trademark of the left, revolt against taboos, has become, to quite a large extent, the emblem and the strategy of the new right, the alt-right. The populists present themselves as those who dare to say what the others privately think, are ashamed to say, those who dare to enjoy without shame and live with taboos. While the left is preaching political correctness, the woke culture, which seems like an inversion of roles. It's like there was a sort of mirroring double movement. The call to enjoy without hindrances, without shame, is the slogan of the revolt, of emancipation, and then its grotesque counterpart was the rise of shamelessness as an obscene power, thwarting, redirecting the slogans of the left. And grotesque can be used in the way that Foucault speaks about grotesque sovereignty, and Frank has written a beautiful illuminating text on this. Transgression is something that obfuscates repression. It doesn't lift it. Repression gets obfuscated in the idea of transgression. Now, what is obscene? Here is another notion that one could bring in line with Freud's designation of the uncanny. Something comes to light that should have remained hidden, and sees something that one shouldn't be seen. What should have been hidden has come to light. But what is it? Is it the truth that comes to the fore with this exposure of the hidden? And that would be an ultimate irony in this, truth coming out as an obscenity. But this is not at all what is at stake. To be sure, there was always an obscene side to power. Its shameful hidden secrets, its blunt self-interest behind the pretense of ideas, its greed, megalomania, vulgarity, malice, greed, whatever, which are in obscenity put on display. The business of the classical critique of ideology is precisely this, to debunk the hidden dirty secrets of power. But if all this comes to the fore, are we finally seeing its hidden truth, uncovered, unveiled, without dissimulation? Well, anything but. Quite the contrary. What we see is just another image, another fake, not some deep truth, and actually a more insidious story, sort of meta. Obscenity is not the mark of truth. It's the way the very unveiling starts functioning as a veil. The shadowy double
has its veil coming out and starts acting as the biggest boost of ideology. The emperor may take off his clothes and people may cry, "Emperor is naked," pointing out the obvious, but to no avail. And even more, the emperor may proudly cry out, "Look, I'm naked," as being always in advance of his average critics. The great title of the forthcoming book by Yuval Kremnitzer, The Emperor's New Nudity. Emperor's New Nudity somehow captures this moment. And this has like the structure of the Freudian joke, like the Freudian meta joke. Why are you so massively demonstrating to me that power is obscene? I know full well that power is obscene, so why are you lying to me? So this is the mechanism for which lifting the illusion actually heightens and enhances the illusion. The lifting of the veil turns into the most obdurate veil. And the obfuscation coincides with the coming out of the hidden. And broadly speaking, what looks like lifting the repression is the sign that the repression itself gets repressed. And this may be a simple diagnosis qualifying present times, the astounding degree to which the repression itself can get repressed. When did the shameless times begin? I evoked Kafka briefly in the beginning. The strange congruence between Jules sans entrave and Loi sans entrave. So let me come back to him regarding the question of shame. It comes up in the most conspicuous spot, tellingly, with the last sentence of the trial after Joseph K., who has never been accused of anything or sentenced, is at the end executed, stabbed to death by two executioners. I quote these last couple of sentences. With his failing sight, K. could still see the gentleman right in front of his face, cheek pressed against cheek, as they observed the decisive moment. Like a dog, he said, it was as if the shame would outlive him. This is the end of the Kafka story. Wie ein Hund, sagte es war, als sollte die Scham ihn überleben. So this sentence is most remarkable, for it seemingly presents almost the exact inversion of Lacan's opening statement. K dies, but the shame outlives him. It's not the shame of not dying of shame. It's the shame reaching beyond grave. A shame one cannot be rid of, even if one succeeds to vanish. He doesn't die of shame, he's executed. He doesn't put up a resistance, but the shame of it will live on. Not the shame of survival, afterlife, but as the afterlife of shame. In shame, we outlive our death. This was Lacan's perplexing formula. With K, the shame outlives his death. The downfall of the big other, and here most overwhelmingly and sometimes most elusively present as the court and law, coincides with the massive presence of an unfathomable big other beyond the other of the law. And K's infinite shame can be taken as a response to this boundless other beyond the figure of the traditional. Kafka can be read as introduction of shameless times, of the obscenity of power. But this happens to coincide also exactly with the time of the introduction of psychoanalysis. And Kafka is like Freud's alter ego. So that this dimension of shame presents in some sense its proper object, psychoanalysis, the ambience surrounding its origin. It's not a psychoanalysis stuck with the paternal law and linked to its fate, which was like Foucault's criticism. Rather, it emerged precisely at the point of the decline of that, when it lost its way and gave way to another figure, the other. Lacan, who had a knack for slogans, proposed this slogan, which is sort of pun wordplay in French, père ou pire, which means father or worse. Paternal law, patriarchy, father, that was bad enough. And we are heading for worse. Could we say the psychoanalysis and K's infinite shame beyond death are both conditioned by this incipient shamelessness? K's unexpected introduction of shame, more than half a century later, can be taken as a reminder of this in face of a new stage of shamelessness. So now let me finish on a personal note, like I started, with another anecdote, another visit of Paris, witnessing another moment of glory. So I was there for the first time in 1969, then other times, but a decade later, in 1980, by some stroke of fortune, I got a grant to study in Paris. And I spent the 70s in this group in Ljubljana that Frank mentioned, studying structuralism, psychoanalysis, and eventually concentrating on Lacan, who in our view pushed the things furthest. And there was a belief that the big other exists. It's called EFP, École Freudienne de Paris, that was Lacan's organization. This is the Lacan school, which he founded in 1964, representing for us the cutting edge of the theoretical critical endeavors at large. This is where I wanted to be. But the moment I arrived in Paris in January 1980, there was a big front page title in Le Monde. Lacan has dissolved his school. His famous letter of dissolution is dated January the 5th, 1980. So the front page title spelled it out in all letters, quite literally. The big other has dissolved itself. It doesn't exist anymore. And this precisely coincided with my arrival and decision to be at the heart of it. So the moment of the apex of this big other, which was called for the end of May, was the moment of its dissolution. And this was my second big psychoanalytic lesson. It was primetime news, a major intellectual political event at the time. The fate of psychoanalysis was being decided there. And the fate of psychoanalysis was then like intimately linked with the fate of the world at large. So I followed Lacan's last seminar, which entirely dealt with the nature of dissolution, the work of dissolution, the work of dissolving the glue. There is, again, a French pun, l'école, which is the school, la colle, the glue. So there is a glue presented by institutions and their peoples, undoing the glue of the big other, travail de dissolution, how to dissolve the glue, how to undo the petrified big other that his own institution started to present. But Lacan's point at the time was not the ending, but the renewal, the renovation, the renaissance of the psychoanalytic Christ, who seems to have been stuck in the glue of his own institution through its very success. But 40 years on, it seems that this courageous attempt, we are facing with a situation that cannot be described otherwise as psychoanalysis in big trouble with the crisis. But perhaps his act of dissolution is actually, ironically, ultimately successful in a disastrously different way. Doesn't it sound like another wish fulfillment turned into a nightmare? Namely, the big other was dissolved far more than anyone could imagine at the time. We got the enjoyment without hindrances, and the big other was indeed dismantled. And didn't psychoanalysis always maintain that it was lacking anyway? So the demands of the time turned into grotesque. When Lacan proposed the dissolution of his school in January 1980, provoking a general shock which caused ripples around the globe, it seemed that he was undoing the success story of his entire career, putting into question at the peak of its reputation and influence, calling for a reinvention instead of defending the acquired status. But looking back, his act in 1980, strangely, uncannily, coincided with what can, in retrospect, be seen as the advent of neoliberalism, inaugurating its subsequent triumphant march. Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, both symbolically marking the beginning of another era. And one can ironically say that the era was profoundly marked by a very different kind of dissolution, the dissolution of some basic nature of social bonds, undoing the social fabric, undoing the glue of the other succeeded all the way. The spread of neoliberalism, its many facets, overshadowed the last 40 years since Lacan's death and held in check the critical theory at large, including psychoanalysis. To the point that one is almost tempted to propose the question, what was psychoanalysis? Which is Carlton Hannah Arendt, who has this famous paper on what is authority. She starts off by saying, the question is not what is authority, what was authority, because authority is vanished in modern times. And yes, and actually another book which is coming out, I have a book of mine with Versa, collection of essays, but somehow conversationally I mentioned this, what was psychoanalysis? And suddenly they want me to take this title, this will sell. Somebody had the cheek to bring out the book saying, what was psychoanalysis? Okay. Of course, in a sense, psychoanalysis has always been in crisis. Freud was attacked from the first moment on. It was deemed outrageous, insufficient, problematic, questionable, scandalous on so many grounds, flawed, declared passé so many times. But this were the crisis that propelled its momentum, constantly its own capacity for innovation. The crisis we're witnessing now is of another order. And if psychoanalysis doesn't have a universal appeal, it looks like the very nature of universality has changed. There's a difficulty, and another kind of difficulty to stick to the universal. And I will finish with this formula. Is the crisis of crisis itself. Crisis itself is in crisis. So maybe we're standing on the brink of this situation, crisis of crisis, now coming to an end. And most likely all kinds of catastrophic ends possible unless we act very quickly. And I have no good message for the end, except this brief reminder of the question of shame in psychoanalysis, the history of shame in the last half century in face of shameless times. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mladen. We have time, as you all expected, for questions, and I moderate questions from the chat. So if someone wants to raise something with Mladen, just put it in the chat, and I'll read it out. This one, should we start with the option the people in the room can raise a question. Are there any immediate responses? Yeah, please.
I was just wondering about like the relationship between what you would call shame, and then also because you mentioned around at the end, like the idea of like collective guilt, and then the moment that she kind of identified the difference between guilt and responsibility, and collective guilt would often be this blanket moment of obscuring those who are actually like guiltier to a harsher degree than a sort of universalized experience of guilt. And then affective experience that can almost like block analytical thought.
Yeah. Well, maybe I touched on too many things. Maybe for a long trajectory of kind of the story of my life. How did this happen? I witnessed the downfall of the Derrida during my lifetime. And so, yes, one aspect was this difference between guilt and shame. And well, I mentioned that guilt is something that can be subjectivized, and it actually can propel or feel a whole life. And look at Christianity; it's a culture of guilt. It feeds on guilt. You're constantly guilty and deficiency, but you can then confess, you can repent. There is an absolution of guilt, but you cycle guilt. And there was an interesting anthropological discussion, actually, which is still going on to some extent, of cultures of guilt versus the cultures of shame. I think Ruth Benedict started with this in the 30s. And okay, it's an interesting observation that the Eastern cultures are far more cultures of shame. I mean, the worst thing that happened is that you lose your face. And the discussion was structured in such a way that what you are afraid of in these cultures of shame is losing your face, that appearances are not maintained. You cannot maintain, you can no longer maintain appearance. So shame is constructed as externally motivated. You don't want to lose your face in a way.
in the face of the big other. Whereas guilt cultures are, I mean, the problem of guilt is internalization. It's internalization. You may not lose your faith, but nevertheless internally know that you are guilty. And it gnaws you. It works, it turns your life into nightmare. You're constantly bound with this. So there's a problem with this classification. It's a very rough, maybe too rough kind of way of looking at it. And the problem, and actually there's a nice book by my friend Robert Fowler. His nice book is on the question of shame, but he brings out the whole discussion with various contributions to this. And the problem is that if one defines it in such a way, then you have a sort of secret agenda of a progress from cultures of shame, which are externalized, to cultures of guilt, which are internalized. So you have like a civilizational progress from the one to the other, which then means that you somehow judge, measure different civilizations against the yardstick. And the yardstick are, of course, we, the Christian culture, in relation to which the others appear as sort of not yet being able to internalize the way that we are able to internalize. So there's a very problematic side to this discussion. Although I think it nevertheless names that Christianity is profoundly a religion of guilt, which is not so much the case in the East. You have a different kind of yes, and there's a question of responsibility. In shame, you are riveted to something you're not responsible for. This is a terrible thing. You cannot run away. Whereas guilt is sort of taking on responsibility for something you did wrong, and you know you did this wrong, and you should remedy this, but then you can't. But, and then there's an internal drama attached to this. So, this would be a bit quick.
Yeah.
Just as a follow-up, what you just said, do you think the increase in like the progress of a culture that has managed to make a step from shame to guilt, that is a factor in shamelessness rising?
I think the particular kind of shamelessness would be tied to the guilt culture.
I was just wondering, when you were talking about this, if you might see a connection between this, because there's something you're tied to something you're not responsible for directly in shame, but then there's a way of interiorizing and subjectivizing and creating some sort of responsibility in guilt. But then at the same time, in this idea of a I don't know if it's a historical process or a ontological process, but we're now dealing with shamelessness, and I was wondering if you see a connection.
Yes. No. I think the general conceptual difference is somehow along the lines to what I said in response to your question. But if you look at particular historical situations, it's very difficult to distinguish the two. The question of shamelessness being tied to also the absence of guilt, or particular very obvious, conspicuous wrongdoings. Nobody was ever ashamed, and nobody was ever guilty for the big crash, economic crash in 2008. It was the biggest economic crash in the world history. It was billions and billions hundreds of billions of dollars being fueled in by being brought in by the state to cover the private losses. Nobody was ever either guilty or ashamed. Nobody was ever held accountable for this. It's a very, very massive fact. So yes, the distinction between guilt and shame in this case is kind of it collapses. I mean, it's linked. It boils down maybe to the same kind of question at the end. Yeah. But yes, I mean, you know, the whole agenda was the economy be run by the free market, and any intervention by the state is fine. And then precisely this politics provoked the biggest state intervention into the economy ever in history. So there's this paradox, which is conspicuous, which is blatant for everyone to see. Nobody was either legally held accountable or felt guilty or be ashamed for this.
Take one question. We have several in the chat, and you just pretend I'm reading it. It's horrible. One thing I read. Thank you very much for your interesting and insightful lecture. The story is that Lacan's response to the revolutionary student was something along the lines of what you demand is a new master that you will get. Through this, he attributed a hysterical character to the revolution of '68. Could this be understood as in the context of your talk to mean that the demand for the abolition of shame will eventually lead to a new form of shame, and that the demand for shameless enjoyment is the demand of the hysteric?
The demand of shameless enjoyment is absolutely not the demand of the hysteric. And this is, but it's true that it's true that Lacan, in some sense, treats the demands of the May Revolution as something that could go in the direction of hysteric response. But this is not at all criticism. I mean, this would be the good part. the hysterical. If they stuck to the hysterical demand, that would be all right. That would be far more productive. But the demand for shameless enjoyment is precisely not hysterical. It's the demand is simple lifting of repression and let's go for the whole thing. It's a transgressive demand. And there's a problem with transgression. Lacan always has problems. Transgression as a sort of seemingly subversive thing.
Yeah.
So I hope my question doesn't take you too far away from the topic of your presentation, but I'm interested in your characterization of shame as as having nothing to do with lack and having everything to do with surplus. And I specifically want to tie this to Lacan's return to Freud's case of the young homosexual woman in Seminar 10, where he characterizes, or he extracts the French criminological phrase passage à l'acte to describe the moment when his former analyst Anne throws herself off of a bridge onto railway tracks when she meets the gaze of her father in the street while she's with her lover, the woman of ill repute. And Lacan seems to be using this phrase and extracting the phrase passage à l'acte to establish a relationship between the success of the young homosexual woman's fantasy of being shameless in front of her father, rather than to characterize a response to lack. And so really my question is, what for you is the relationship between shame and the clinical structure of psychosis? Is sustained psychosis a sort of sustained experience of shame or response to shame in a sense, or is it something, does it have a different relationship to the structure of psychosis?
Now, first, the first part, the question of social act. Lacan, I mean, always had this sharing of concept, this opposition between acting out and social act. And a lot of hysterical, a lot of hysterical pathology can be seen as acting out, which means that one sort of escapes into an act which would not change the fundamental parameters of the situation, and acts precipitately, whatever, and one acts very dramatically, but without changing the basic parameters. And a lot of, okay, Slava has made a case often for the sort of leftist acting out. We should do something. Let's run into some action. Let's not just theorize, whatever. So there's a pressure, and often then this pressure, let's do something, is rather acting out, rather evasion into action. One escapes into action instead of thinking about the very parameters, the basic parameters of the situation, how to change them. Whereas passage à l'acte is precisely the sort of act that would change the basic parameters. Yeah, that would be the genuine action would be that. And passage à l'acte is in a way, in Lacan, it's a sort of one can do this by a strange suspension of it. One does this regardless of any other considerations or regardless of the expectation of the big other. When this would be the passage à l'acte, this would be a proper act which would kind of change then the very parameters. As to your other question of what shame is linked to psychosis, I'm not sure. I mean, seriously, don't have an instant answer, but I would think shame is sort of transversal to the three clinical structures, delusion, neurosis, and psychosis. But let me not improvise too much in front of the audience. I mean, perversion obviously has a tendency to shamelessness, but not quite, because it has to be done within a certain very defined conditions. It's not just exposure to the big other, shameless exposure to the big other. It has to be done under very precise conditions. It is always the scriptwriter, the director, the actor of his act somehow, and the audience. This is the problem maybe of perversion. And so the question of shame, nevertheless, conditions or somehow colors, so it's present. It's not a suspension of the big other. Perversion is not a suspension of the big other. This is maybe part of the problem. So I say. In psychosis, there's the problem of the collapse and the universalization, as it were, of the big other. I mean that the three dimensions of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real are collapsed into one. And somehow intuitively wouldn't think that this leads to universalization of shame, which was your question. But sorry, I really, let me not improvise too much. But it's a very good question.
Thank you for your response.
Okay, another one from the chat. Thanks for the excellent talk. A question: what is the significance of the H as the soundless sound or caesura in the ontology pun? Does it relate to the work of punning in general, or is the role of the letter as real important here in the language of concept formation that's involved?
No, well, I'm not sure, but anyway, there is this curious thing that you have these two famous puns in the ontology. One is Derrida's Hontology, but in French is hauntology, from honte. Honte is the French word for haunting, and it's spelled with H. And this H consonant. So you have two kinds of H in French. One which imposes a caesura, but the other one doesn't. And the H which imposes a caesura are French words coming of German origin, basically of Germanic origin. It's kind of funny that the haunting dimension is somehow ascribed to the word itself. That there is the letter which is the soundless letter. It's just a caesura, and yes, is caesura formative of punning? I mean, you have this famous Fredgeri, the white bug, ubu, the wood, the king, whatever. It's English pronunciation of this word. I mean, it's so evocative in French. I don't know if you say you, it loses the edge. And yes, Frank wrote about this question of the grotesque. I mean, the particular spot where Foucault speaks about the grotesque sovereignty, and where he brings in the king as a major case of grotesque sovereignty. And this is very interesting because King Ibu, this is like 1897, which is exactly again the time of the birth of psychoanalysis. And this was a man as far away from Kafka as possible, his farce, but who nevertheless, in this farce somehow brought in the question of the breakdown of sovereignty at that time. It's an indication of the time. And yes, I started on Jarry only for another reason, namely that he also established, he was great for inventing the signifiers, like Ibu. And another signifier he proposed was pataphysics as opposed to metaphysics. And pataphysics would be the science of the exception, whereas metaphysics is the science of the rule. But, and here's my point, sorry for the long digression, he said, but pataphysics should always be written with an apostrophe at the beginning. It's completely senseless in French. It's like P as a sort of Ashmasan. There's a to avoid confusion. It was always written with an apostrophe. So you can see what differentiates pataphysics from pataphysics. It's the mere apostrophe. So yes, I think it's a brilliant pun. Although it's not a pun, it's somehow a pun on itself.
Okay, you just raise your hand if there is any question. Yes, please.
I have a question. I think there are two opposite points about the shame. One point is shame is very necessary. Shame is the philosophy effect, and one point is nothing to be shame enough. And in China, I think there is a philosophy figure named Kongzi. She thinks the shame, the core of the shame is being humble and also obeying the rules and manners. Shame, restraining people's behavior is very important because it tells you what you need to do, what you can to do. So what do you think of this difference? Do you think shame is very necessary to the people?
As I said, I think that the shame is essential. Shame is absolutely essential, and the whole trajectory of my talk was like the decline of the feeling of shame, which Lacan named in 1969, as very strangely in relating to the revolutionaries at the time, and the decline of the which I should feel shame. And this is a very difficult position of psychoanalysis, to maintain both that big other is absolutely necessary to form the social bonds, to form the social fabric, whatever, solidarity, anything. And on the other hand, that the big other is also lacking, which means it doesn't provide a transcendental guarantee. Both things are difficult to think together. We need a big other, and the big other is lacking. And shame is placed somewhere in that trajectory. And yes, I don't know enough about Chinese society in that respect, but as it is perceived from the West, and I'm very, very aware of my limited. It's a society where shame is absolutely crucial, central, or sort of an essential ingredient, I'd say. Probably, at least from what I somehow see from the distance, and of course, this always has the implications. I'm very well aware of the implications of this discussion of cultures of shame, possible racist bias. Let's say, quick that is implied in this kind of work. So yes, but insisting on the notion of shame as being essential, it was one of the points of my book.
Okay, another one from here. Thank you so much, Mladen. I was hoping you could speak more about the role of the imaginary. Of course, today we're constantly bombarded with images. The imago of the image allows us to enjoy the shamelessness of us, which we may feel ashamed of afterwards. Does the rise of the image correlate to the dimming of the big other? Could this partly be ascribed to the fact that we are, in fact, displacing shame onto others?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a very valid situation. I think that this waning of the big other. I mean, I'll be speaking about this also tomorrow from two different perspectives. The one perspective would be the question of rumors, rumorization of society, and the way that rumorization of society has what role it has played in this deactivation of any authority can be somehow relegated to rumor. The rumors present a backdrop. But this goes actually hand in hand also with the rise of this culture of images, the selfie culture. So this kind of deactivation of the symbolic authority, I think, has many symptoms, and one of the symptoms is the rise of the image and sort of the rise of the. I think the rise of the imaginary has a big role in this to play. It goes hand in hand. Rumorization. More to bring down all the authorities and relegate them to rumors. I mean, touch upon this, the less there is this big other, the more it becomes a big other with images and memorization, the more is the phantom of the big other actually touch beyond all this. So it can bring down the authorities, and this seems like a process of liberalization, emancipation, whatever. But then actually stuck with a much bigger problem. And yes, I agree. I don't give a properly developed answer, but I agree with the observation that image culture
Okay. If we alternate, you raise your hands when you want to say something. There's another question from the chat. Thanks for this illuminating talk. I could not catch parts of the lecture due to an audio problem. I wonder if there's an analogy. Heidegger suggests that one is always in being, and may use the analogy of nakedness here, and so is the logic of subjectivization always shame in terms of an interior relation.
Well, yes, Heidegger has put some things in fact, and I should have talked, for instance, about the famous Sartre example. You look through the peephole and suddenly you hear the footsteps approaching, and you are called out as being this voyeur. This is a very famous case we discussed many times, and that's there also Levinas, and of course the dimension of Dasein, which relates to Eidos, and he doesn't quite speak. As far as I remember, he doesn't quite speak of shame, of sham, but about shoy. Shoy is his work, which is what?
Shyness.
The shyness of war. In highest it looks me shyness.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, right. Oh, maybe. Yeah. So yes, yeah. Yes. I mean, this would have been a different kind of paper if I tried to develop shame on its own. I wanted to concentrate on a particular history of shame from 69 to now, in the last 50 years. Well, why did Lacan intervene with the question of shame in that particular situation after the May 68 event? And what the hell happened? Which is linked to the whole fate of psychoanalysis in the past 50 years, from this thing which was the universal point of reference to something which is like riddled to really a sideshow, sort of lost the capacity of innovation, of universality, wasn't there? Because this is the one thing that is really great in psychoanalysis, that if you look at the beginning, it's Freud and Lacan. I mean, Freud started off as a psychoanalysis as a private clinical practice, accessible only to a few people in Vienna and then a few other cities. But within his lifetime, from 1900 to his death in 1939, he became the universal point of reference. His intervention discussed in science and philosophy and art. Everybody in the world knew about him. I mean, for many wrong reasons also, but the capacity to present a universal reference, to instill a new universal reference, is really astounding in Freud's career. I mean, if you look at the number of people before the Second World War who had actual experience with psychoanalysis, negligible, and the immense effect this had worldwide on humanities, particularly in art, but also in all kinds of other areas, social theory. And then after the war, I mean, there was the figure of Lacan, which is became far more widespread as an experience, but still, it's completely astounding that theory, which is that difficult, is impenetrable in so many ways. It really demands huge engagement. became the universal point of reference, which it was those cases when that I mentioned, 69, when it first came in Paris, particularly in 1980, the dissolution of the school, which seemed to be sort of worth historically that. Maybe it was, but in a different kind of way. It seemed this was a call for innovation, which perhaps marked the end of an era.
I put myself also on the list. I have just an association, and I wonder what you were thinking about this. I mean, you presented a kind of sequence analysis, one could say, that begins with a particular crisis, the breakdown of sovereignty, that is linked to the birthplace, the birth time of psychoanalysis itself, and its capacity to work with crisis, to work with exactly that right? Because it was a particular form of undoing. I mean, this is right. This is what you pointed out when you were talking about the work of the solution. It's a particular undoing, which is why it was so innovative and so creative, right? It was able to undo itself over and over again. And then something happens with that functioning of crisis. I mean, right? You said today crisis is in crisis. It is almost as if one could say undoing reached its end, or there's an undoing worse than the undoing that was still done. Right? It's an undoing that so undoes that is unclear, right? If anything is left. So I mean, on one hand side, it seems, I was wondering, that's the first, and forgive me, that's also a concept maybe. Right? In Lacan, it's so creative because he introduces at one point, I mean, for many reasons, but the variable session length. So particular working with time. And it seems your sequence analysis and what was psychoanalysis seems to indicate maybe there is no longer a variable session length of psychoanalysis. Maybe it's just right now it's determined. It is located between here and there. But the real question I wanted to raise, that was the association, was what is the character of this undoing having come full circle? That's the crisis of the crisis. You suggest that it can't be perverse, right? Because perversion always functions within a certain framework. You shied away or said it's not unclear if that is psychotic. It's a bit the question of the discourse of the capitalism, right? So, because it's interesting, as long as we still are doing things, practices of undoing can induce shame to the right amount. But if there is undoing preceding everything, how does one get to the good form of undoing?
The good form of undoing.
Yeah.
Well, of course, you're asking the $1 million question that with which I start.
Yes, I know.
Hell, I know. I still can't think of a strategy to somehow stick to some sort of Bechettian on. That one has to persevere with this. I mean, there's something very real that happened with psychoanalysis, and then from the 60s on, with Lacan, this sort of structuralist thing. It's something very real. And I mean, there's a lot of sentiment. Okay, boomer. I mean, take it upon myself. I mean, the whole talk can be interpreted as okay, boomer.
And there's a more serious sort of varying with all structuralist, post-structuralist saying, and let's go somewhere else, like to hard science, like cognitive science, object-oriented ontology. Let's stop this obsession with discourse and things and go to real thing. I'm very skeptical about this. I mean, as a development. So the best strategy I can still think of is to present papers like this. To which my course is to persevere with a certain on. There has to be, there is an injunction on that one must hold on to in this. Injunction of on, which is disentangled from. Okay, I think both Lacan's acknowledgement and the remainder of shame, I'm using shame into, and his sort of je persevere and this sort of rhetoric. Let me be the severe father now that father is gone. Well, I think both things are problematic. I would also read this ending of one session as a sort of symptom. Let me induce shame in you. I'm inducing shame in you just a little, just enough, a right measure of shame. I don't want to be the father who said you should be ashamed of yourself. But also, I don't want to be the father to say, don't be ashamed of yourself. This is anything is fine. Be yourself. Again, don't feel guilty or whatever. So he somehow tries a path between these two extremes. No? I don't know if with great success. I take it as symptomatic of a certain situation and that he names a certain problem there. I don't know if maybe he was in a situation of a person who
could do sort of analytic gesture in front of an audience. And maybe it had
this kind of value. And but still I'm not happy with it. I'm not happy with it as a sort of strategy. You should feel ashamed. Let me induce some shame. Something. I don't see. I read it more as a symptom than as a sort of. It names a certain problem. It names a serious political problem, and it's great that he could see that situation. Well, there was this elation, enthusiasm for the May Revolution. It goes against the grain.
Maybe that would be the only way of rescuing on or what, right?
Yeah.
Honor. Sorry, but okay. One more from here, if you have. Yeah. Okay. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm interested. Somewhat connects to Frank's question, and I'm quite interested in the change of regime of shamelessness in the anecdote that you evoked of the TV host. How somehow the point wherein the symbolic transgresses into being is maybe testified at the sight of the fly on the presenter's face. And in this regime, it seems that ontology is rather easy, or has a rather simple task, where one can posit the presuppositions, which is the symbolic setting of the news show. And as you pointed out, this is complicated now because everything is out in the open. This is itself incorporated into the symbolic domain. And this therefore seems to pose a significant difficulty for identifying or even conducting such a dialectical reversal of identifying the conditions of such a shameful ontology to occur. And this even therefore seems to pose a stronger problem of identifying that this is even such a difficulty to identify. And I'm wondering if this is maybe what you're trying to achieve in saying that crisis is in crisis. It's not only crisis itself is in crisis, but it's even more difficult to identify why crisis is in such a crisis. because ontology, therefore, is such a difficult task. And I'm wondering if this is what you're speaking to, of like an atrophy of one side of the other. Is one side of the other completely crystallized in this hyper shamelessness to such a point that it's so difficult to even identify what our crises are?
I couldn't agree more. It's your observation. I don't know if it's really a question. I mean, it's absolutely in that direction. It's the downfall of the sort of symbolic big other complicates the problem enormously. How does it crystallize? So, what kind of dimension do we have to deal with? And this is good minus with the whole question of the superego. I mean, superego is a kind of problem slightly, or maybe not, because you know that there's this major shift, which is already perceptible in Freud, but which Lacan emphasis on, of the functioning of the father's prohibition. You know, there's always a prohibition to the injunction, the superego actually commands you to enjoy. You can't enjoy without superego enjoyment. And this is again, I mean, as long as we had fathers who said, don't do this, you had the easy escape into the easy strategy of transgression, and bringing down the general authority as a father, showing, look, the other is lacking, this is an father authority, arbitrary, whatever. And it's much more difficult to deal with an authority which says, well, enjoy, be yourself. A lot of identity politics is actually based on this. Be yourself. Don't be ashamed of yourself. Show your true identity. Be true to yourself. This is why I also think it's kind of.
So yes, I mean the injunction with superego is just another case of what you're expecting.
After the fall down of the big other, I mean, there's the other saying, joy, and how the hell. And sorry, no, I don't want to joy. I want to be miserable. Enough enjoyment. But again, you say enough enjoyment, you know, in French, de jouir, which is Lacan's pun again, you know, which means no more enjoyment and surplus enjoyment. I mean, the same word. You say plus de jouir, stop enjoying, but this again creates a surplus enjoyment which can reinvigorate. Very logic. It's set up against.
Okay, we have one final question.
I'm still struggling to formulate it into a question, but I could put it a simple question. And there's, could you clarify what your relationship is and what you think Lacan's relationship is to Agamben? Agamben kept coming here on the sides, and I'm a bit puzzled because you spoke of sort of decline of shame, identified by Lacan in 1969. I was thinking of what Agamben would say in relation to that, and he'd probably say something like, "Well, hasn't declined." If you brought up the story of Adam and Eve, and Agamben has talked about shame in relation to the Holocaust, which you referred to, and he's also in relation to questions of unity and Adam and Eve. And he wants to say that the embrace of modern day unity is not a decline of shame. He wants to say that it's a continuation of Christianity by other means, by a displacement of the concepts of grace and of glory. So Augustine, for example, spoke of the clothing of grace. That's one of Augustine's expressions. So Agamben points out that in the story of Adam and Eve, according to Augustine, it's not that they were naked and they didn't know it. They weren't clothed. They just weren't clothed in the clothes of human labor, clothes of sin, clothes of animal skin, or of vegetable matter. They were in divine clothes, clothes of grace. And Agamben says, the clothes of grace continue to be with us, just in different forms in the 20th century. And so, for example, movements like nudism, or watch so many television shows nowadays, which are 18 shows where you see someone naked, And you would say that's not a decline of shame at all, because it's continuing on a certain notion of glory and grace, which is itself lodged within shame. And so it's actually a continuation of this system.
Mm-hmm.
So now I was wondering what to make of that in relation to Lacan and the decline. But you see, the reason I'm very hesitant is I also know the problem with honte and pudeur. So there are two words which could be translated. I can't use them both. There's a complex question about. You did bring up Adam and Eve, which would normally be the pudeur notion of shame.
No, well, no, you asked a much larger question of it's called Book on Nudity. I mean, I wanted to sidestep Agamben, the particular problem he links to the Holocaust and the shame of survival, almost, and the whole Primo Levi thing, which is it's a great. It causes obviously it's a great problem. It's a great problem. People did die of shame because of the Holocaust. I mean, including Primo Levi, and which is not merely the shame of survival, but also Primo Levi. One of the problems is that this is a system which wouldn't allow you to be innocent. You had to somehow, Mercy and Salvati, belong to the saved and wanted to survive, you had to collaborate this. It's about a bit of shame that guilt, actually. Guilt and shame of survival. And I find his
I wanted to avoid this discussion, but now what you're asking is this the end of what is described as the end of shame is for Agamben a sort of continuation of
another form of what was there at the outset. It has the same structure. I think Agamben's analysis of this has the same structure as his analysis of the sacred and profanation, which means, is capitalism the end of the sacred? It is the profanation, and his point is the universal. It's universalization of the sacred. Is the impossibility of profanation. And I think it has his argument regarding unity has some sort of same structure. It's not a discontinuation. It's actually the universalization of a certain structure, which has taken on a new form. And his famous analysis of profanation, which capitalism is, I mean, goes back to Benjamin's capitalism as religion piece, which just shows the impossibility of getting out of this religious experience by what seems to be profanation. Is a basic predicament. I think it has the argument has the same structure. Sorry, I'm being very clear to this point.
No, we reached the end of our session. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for attending online. Tomorrow's workshop is going to take place in the DCA at 11 o'clock. Come prepared. There are 2 texts I sent around the link. If you haven't registered and want to come, you email me. I sent you the link. Anyhow, now we get to thank Mladen for what was an absolutely amazing and brilliant paper, and thank you for the Q&A and for being